Well, thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your expertise. And now I'm going to ask you a handful of questions that are in my plain English. This is what I want to understand from you. And you've already covered quite a bit. So the first, about trials. So what's the biggest challenge running a clinical trial that's related to a rare disease? Dr. Malik.
So I think the biggest challenge revolves around the fact that this is such a rare disease. And recruitment is quite tough, especially if you break down MG based on antibody or other categories. So I think enrollment is a big issue. The other issue is that there are such few physicians who treat MG, and then even fewer medical centers that participate in clinical trials. So it's not accessible, and it's definitely, because it's such a rare disease, recruiting patients for studies is quite difficult.
I would agree that recruitment is, thank you. I would agree that recruitment is a major challenge. The other thing that would be challenging is the lack of natural history information or data. So it's really important for patients to participate in the registrational or the registry data or questionnaires that are out there, because that really does help companies like ours learn a little bit more about myasthenia gravis and what patients are looking for or what is missing.
Does everyone know about the MG registry? No. Okay. The Myasthenia Gravis Foundation of America offers a registry for MG patients. Online, they invite you to take a survey, and they collect the data, and it's all patient provided data. It's not physician data. So feel free to go. Their website is myasthenia.org. Whereas ours is myastheniagravis.org. So, okay. So go to myasthenia.org, and you'll find a place to fill in a survey. And they'll use your information to help researchers start to figure out what are the issues for MG patients.
If I may add a word to what was just said, which we absolutely agree with, but I think also working in rare diseases is an opportunity for the drug companies to interact with people and groups like you. And this is not something that you would necessarily do for more common diseases where it's very easy to find patients. So I think there is a positive aspect to it that is really important, is to hear directly from you what are your needs, what you expect from us.
What's the greatest reward running a clinical trial that's related to a rare disease?
So I think there are maybe a couple of rewards. One of them, of course, is that you're participating in an endeavor to really expand medical knowledge, and that's obviously something that invigorates me as a young physician and a young scientist. And then, of course, the second biggest reward is that if I'm working and participating in a clinical trial that leads to the development of a new treatment, which is more effective and is able to improve the quality of life for my patients, where they have more days where they feel like themselves and less days where they feel like an MG patient. I think that's sort of the biggest reward, I think.
I would have to agree with you, Dr. Malik, that one of the major rewards is to know that we're working on new treatment options for patients who have limited treatment options or options that aren't really working for them or that they're satisfied with.
Great. Okay, you already covered this one, but I'll ask it one more time, just because some of the words are hard for if you're not used to them. So what's the difference between a clinical trial and a basic science trial?
Right, so we learned that clinical trials involves people. When we talk about basic science or basic research, we also refer to it as bench research. So this is mostly research that occurs in a laboratory where we're using perhaps test tubes and beakers and such. So it's sort of almost like a phase 0 or preclinical type of a study. Some of the information that we learn in basic science research may help actually with clinical trials in the future. So that's sort of the big difference.
Okay. When it comes to clinical trials, who are all the players and what are their roles and what does each hope to gain? When it comes to patients, Dr. Malik.
Right. So I'll start with maybe talking about physicians because I'm more comfortable talking about my perspective. As a physician, our role is to make our patients aware of certain clinical trials that our center may be participating in. The second goal is for us to, based on the protocol, understanding what the inclusion and exclusion criteria is, who would be eligible and who would be a good candidate for this study. So the physician will basically help with recruitment. Before we start the study, there typically is a visit called a screening visit where we kind of go over the protocol. We talk about inclusion, exclusion criteria. We talk about risks and benefits. That's where we go over that informed consent that I talked about. And as a patient, you should come in with your list of questions, trying to understand what you're really getting yourself into here. What's the intervention? What type of extra clinic visits are required? How would I be, how would it be determined if I end up in the placebo arm versus the intervention arm? So as a patient, it's important for you to be your own advocate and ask the right questions and go over that informed consent form very carefully. Obviously, the patient is the highest stakeholder in all of this, right? Because you're participating in the research, and possibly we're introducing you to an intervention that we don't know a lot about. We don't know how effective it is. We may not know entirely how safe it is.
Sure. From the pharma perspective or the sponsor perspective, there's actually a lot of people who are behind this research. So, there's people who are actually developing the drug in the science, so doing the basic research. And then you have people who are working in the clinical side who are writing the protocols. They're working with their regulatory colleagues. Those are the people who ensure that we comply with the guidelines that the FDA requires us to follow. In terms of what other things the pharma company does is we actually write the protocols. We do our research to make sure that we're collecting the data that's needed to move this drug along to hopefully get approval from the FDA to have it commercially available. And we partner with patient groups like the Conquer MG group to ensure that the patient perspective is incorporated in what we do, and pass it off to my colleagues too.
I would like to add a few things. The pharma company are blamed. They have I think that's among all the sectors of industry, the pharma industry has the worst reputation among the public. And I'm not here to defend it, but I would like to explain a little bit the way we work. Is when, as you mentioned, when we write a protocol, we have to think, what are the medical questions that we want to answer, but we also have to see what will the FDA require to see before it considers that the drug is safe and efficient. So we have a lot of constraints. You may think that some of the requirements of the protocol don't make sense from your point of view, but sometimes they come from the FDA, and we just have to follow what the FDA tells us to do, and we have little leeway. The other thing also that we have to think about is payers, and if we have a drug that works well, that is approved by the FDA, but for some reason payers don't want to cover it, that doesn't help anyone. We don't make any money, and you don't get to try the drug. So we have also to take this aspect into account. So we have to sort of find a path through all these sort of obstacles to be successful so that you have another drug at your disposal.
So the FDA and insurance companies are additional players in the whole market.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can I ask too, why do some, my next question was, how do you determine clinical trial sites and how do physicians and pharmaceutical companies get connected? But I'm also wondering, why do many doctors not get plugged in to this?
So the way that we select, all of us select clinical trial sites and which doctors to work with is usually there's key opinion leaders or doctors who work very closely in this indication. So for example, for MG, we have the doctors who are like the experts in MG who've worked in it for a long time or who have, and then we work with their institutions as well. We also make sure that the location is good so that, for example, we have approximately 40 sites in the United States for our phase 3 trial. We wanted to make sure that we had enough coverage across the United States so you don't have a patient who's in, for example, Florida, traveling all the way to Chicago to participate in the clinical trial. That just wouldn't make sense for them. And then the other things that we look at are, is there a patient population there to help make sure that we can enroll the study quickly so that, again, once we finish the study, as soon as we can finish it, we can look at the data and we can take that data to the FDA to ask for drug approval. Reasons why doctors may not work with certain companies is maybe they don't have a patient population, and they'll be honest with us. If they don't think they can recruit, it doesn't make sense for everyone to invest all that time to get that site up and running. Or they may be really busy. They may have a lot of interest from a lot of different companies, and they may be participating in 4 or 5 different studies and just don't have the bandwidth to work with another company. So those are some of the reasons why.
Dr. Malik, does it take a lot of time to participate in a study on your part?
Absolutely. I didn't realize how much time it was going to take before I started this. But a large part of it is email communication, which is just overwhelming. There are a lot of emails, and there's some site visits just to make sure that they keep us on task and make sure that our documentation is accurate and complete. And in a lot of medical centers, there's not a support for research, right? It's not a money maker for a hospital. So a lot of physicians are participating in research and clinical trials on their own time. So they don't get protected time typically from the institutions to do research. So that's sort of the difficulty on our end.
I was just going to, maybe you'll agree with this, there's also often an infrastructure required by the research site. So there's staffing that they need study coordinators and all sorts of people to help the physicians execute those studies. So I think there's a lot of reasons some physicians don't want to participate. That being said, if you have a physician that maybe you've talked to about research and would be interested in participating in research, you should let us know. We're always happy to reach out to physicians that might be interested. Some of the physicians in our study have maybe done other clinical trials but not worked in MG and now are working with us in MG. So we always like to hear from you about your doctor if you think it's something we should reach out to them about. But I think there's a lot of reasons people don't want to participate.
Some trials originate or are conducted by universities and others by pharmaceutical companies. Is there a difference in how they're conducted? In what they aim to do or in their funding? Dr. Malik?
Right, so there's usually not a lot of difference in the way they're conducted. All studies are typically approved by a group of people called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. So all studies are monitored by the institutional IRB. All studies follow a protocol. The difference in funding is sort of a minor issue, I would say, but it definitely affects the size of the research study. So mostly the grants or the research funding that we receive from the university may be a smaller amount versus what we may receive from a pharmaceutical company. So those would be some of the differences.
Not all therapies for MG go through the clinical trial process. Why not? And what's the benefit of having clinical trial results, Dr. Malik?
So a lot of medications that MG patients might be taking, there's no clinical trial to back those the use of those medications. They're considered off-label. So you may be on medications that are effective for myasthenia gravis, prednisone, mestinon, IVIG, plasmapheresis. We all know they work for myasthenia gravis, but not all of these medications have had clinical trials to back them. So they're typically used by physicians based on anecdotal reports or cases that have been reported. And there's nothing wrong with that. These are effective medications, and it's a quick way to make sure our patients get the medicines that they need. We don't have to wait for a long period of time to do a research study and come to that same conclusion at the end of it all. But when a drug goes through the process of clinical trial, you just get a lot of information supporting its use. You learn a lot about how effective it is, how safe it is. And then when we're trying to push your insurance to approve some of the medications that we use in treating myasthenia gravis, and if they're off-label, we run into a lot more issues with that versus something that's been approved by the FDA and has clinical trials to back its use.
The next question is, you've talked a lot about what clinical trials try to accomplish, like safety, like it's not going to kill someone, right? or is it that simple? Is safety that simple of a question? Or and what don't they accomplish? Like if I were to go into a trial, what might I be thinking it's going to accomplish, and I'd be barking up the wrong tree? Does that make sense? Okay.
Me? Wow, that's a fully loaded question. So yes, I mean, when we design clinical trials, we try to make sure we think about all the different assessments or all the different tests that we can collect information on. But I think we also have to be aware of people's time. So every time you add on an assessment, it takes time at that study visit. When you come in for your study visit, it takes your time. So we also have to be selective of what things to ask. So we have to pick what's the most important for this clinical research trial. Something I hear a lot about patients is like, why don't you ask questions about my fatigue or my pain or things like that? And sometimes it's just, again, like we ask the essential questions that are required for this study, and sometimes we just can't ask everything because all of that, again, takes time and time from the site, time from you. So we try to be very careful about what's included in the clinical trial. I'm trying to think what else, but maybe my Momenta colleagues have something else to add, and I'll keep thinking.
Let's see if I can add a few things.
Could I ask the responders to possibly stand somewhere in the center a little?
Oh, sure, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't twist your neck. Yeah, so I completely agree with what you just said. I think the other thing is also is we talked about the eligibility criteria. So we select a sort of small group of patients among all the patients who have the disease because we can't study everyone or every form of the disease, especially in the early stages of clinical trials. So clinical trials left out a lot of patients in the general population. The other thing also is that the clinical trials are limited in duration. You have, for example, like we heard about the clinical trial from RA, that the main period of study was 12 weeks plus an extension. But that's still, I don't know how long your extension is, but if it's 6 months or a year, that's still very short, especially for a disease like Myasthenia gravis. So when a drug is on the market, then you have patients who will take it for years. So we can't think about every possible safety issue that could arise after 10 years on the drug that didn't show up in the clinical trial because it lasted only 1 year. So those are also some of the limitations. And there are ways to address this. So for example, the FDA, especially for disease where you know that you will have to take the treatment for a while, the FDA will ask the drug company to continue monitoring patients for years to make sure that if there is a safety issue that has not been identified earlier, it gets identified as soon as possible and then reported to the FDA. And that could result, for example, in a change, in what we call the label, which is the package insert that describes all what is known about the drug. That could result in a modification of the language to identify the new risk. Or for example, that this medication should not be associated with another medication, things that were not identified while the clinical trials was running. So we try to accomplish a lot in the clinical trials, but there are things that we cannot accomplish, and there are processes in place to make sure that these things get caught up later. Thanks.
As far as, Angela, you described the eligibility requirements for your study. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I don't think so. No, I think I went over it.
Okay. Would you, Dr. Jouvin, would you like to add about eligibility requirements for your study?
Yeah, so I think some of you came to our table at the beginning, and we were explaining that the study we're running is a phase 2 study. So the criteria for eligibility are fairly restrictive. What we heard from you is things that we probably can address when we do a phase 3 trial. For example, now we have a limit of age of 64 years old. We probably will be able to raise this limit. The other thing also is depending on the mechanism of action, you will be able to target, or the drug will be able to target different groups of patients. So for example, it was mentioned that for the RA drug, it targets patients who have anti-acetylcholine antibody receptors. Our drug works with a completely different mechanism, so we don't have this restriction. And we think that's an advantage to have various drugs from various drug companies, because there will be differences in the way they work, and it will allow to target different groups of patients. So I think when we're talking about talking to your physician about entering a clinical trial, this is something you want to discuss. What is potentially the best trial for me? And fortunately now, as a patient, you have a broader choice than you had 10 or 20 years ago.
I have one thing to add. One thing I would like to add is, again, we're very careful about the inclusion and exclusion criteria, because ultimately the goal is to get these drugs quickly approved and on the market and commercially available to patients. And sometimes I think patients, I've heard questions like, well, why can't I take like a certain drug? Why is it excluded from your study? And it's because if that could potentially affect the data or what we're seeing from how our drug is working, it would make things really fuzzy and muddy. And so we want to make sure we have clear criteria around that, so that it's very, the data that we provide to the FDA when we go to ask for approval is very clear to them.
Okay. If the study limits eligibility to a certain group of patients, say to ACHR patients or to MuSK-MG patients, what does that mean for study results? And can you translate whatever happened in that group to the broader population? How does that work, Dr. Malik?
Yes, so typically as a physician, I'm very hesitant to use data that's been collected from a certain type of MG patients and apply it to other type of MG patients. Because just because we don't know how effective it is going to be for the other subtype of MG. We kind of talked about how different antibodies in myasthenia gravis affect MG patients in different ways. If a drug is successful in treating one type of MG, it may not be very successful in treating another type of MG. And I think insurance company will have the same argument for this.
Next question, how sick, just to put it in plain English, how sick do you want a patient to be? I mean, Angela, you explained how you put it into the various scales. But For instance, I'm in remission.
Sure. And that's great. Okay. But we do, so for example, for our studies, we have that criteria where you have to have an MG-ADL score of 6 or higher and a QMG score of 12 or higher. And that's specifically because if you have a score that's very low, it really doesn't allow you to have any improvement. So it really wouldn't kind of help us study our drug in a kind of a population who could improve. We actually do not allow patients who have just ocular MG participate in our study. They have to have generalized myasthenia. And again, it's because those patients have probably a QMG or ADL score that's much lower, so they're not as severe. And so we just want to ensure that we have something that we can show improvement while on our study drug. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that.
There is another reason to do this also, is something that is called the risk-benefit ratio. So you said you were in remission. So for you being in remission, it would really not make sense to try.
It would be more risky for me to try the drug.
Exactly.
Right.
So in your case, the risk-benefit ratio would not be favorable. So this is something we as pharmaceutical companies take into account. And the FDA also, when we go to the FDA, we have to be able to demonstrate that no drug is without side effect. That does not exist. So what we have to demonstrate is that a new drug provides enough benefit to a certain group of patients, and the side effects are low enough that overall the risk-benefit ratio is favorable. So this is a big principle of the way all pharma companies work.
Just one additional point. So for patients in remission, just like Joan, there's still an opportunity to participate in research. You could definitely participate in observational trials or maybe even data registry, right? Because if you collect information about your disease process, we're learning something about your disease and maybe learning about why you went into remission and another person didn't. So there's definitely an opportunity for patients who are in disease remission.
Great homework. Okay. Okay, let's move on to what the participant experiences. How do you typically engage with patients throughout the clinical trial process, from pre-trial planning all the way through? Andrew.
Sure. So before the trial starts, typically in clinical trials, you try to have patient-focused groups that come in and help answer questions about what they're looking for, what's frustrating them about their current treatments. So you just collect as much information as you can. As you saw, there is the registry where we're able to kind of look at a large number of patients and how their responses to those questions. And then we've also done surveys with patients, again, like I mentioned on my slide, where we talked about their current treatments available and how they feel about them. And then the other things that we do is even as we go in, so we're in a phase 3 clinical trial, meaning we're getting ready for the drug launch. And we want to make sure that the end user, the patients with MG, actually, when they receive that drug, when they buy it off the shelf or get it prescribed to them and pick it up from the pharmacy, that it looks like something that they could use, that they feel like it would be comfortable for them to use. So we even do research even before we have approval, much in advance before we have approval, on what the drug will look like, how it will be given to them from the pharmacist. Other things that we do is, we engage with you guys at events like this, other events like the national meeting, or at local walks like the one you had earlier. We just want to make sure that we collect as much information from you when you're giving us your perspective and opinions, that we think about this every day when we're doing our work.
I can add a few things also. If you have been following the clinical trials for MG and the development of new drugs, let's say 10 years ago, the FDA really didn't care much about the patient voice. This is changing now in a quite a dramatic way, where there is a possibility for patient association to go to the FDA and speak out and be an advocate for a particular drug. And now the FDA is even going further, and it's likely that the FDA will require all the pharma running clinical trials to have a patient in the clinical team. So people like Amy and myself and you at RA, to have one patient among the team that is in charge of the clinical trial. So I think that's really very important. The other thing also, you mentioned the launch. One thing that Pharma do also is work with payers to make sure that you have access to the drug. And that can, I don't know if you heard about the various ways that can be done, but there are multiple ways that can be used to make sure that you have access to the drugs in a timely manner.
Okay. Dr. Malik, could you describe for us, like if I'm walking into your office, what does that look like? Like is it an extra visit? Is it?
You mean as part of a clinical
trial? As a patient.
As a patient who's participating in the clinical trial, right? There may be some extra visits that are required if you're participating in a clinical trial, and sometimes there may be extra testing that may be also required in forms of extra blood draws, perhaps an EKG. Those are some things to consider if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial.
Would I be going to my regular, if you were not my regular doctor, would I see you both? Would I shift to you for my care?
Right, so this would not be part of your routine medical care. So if you were seeing another neurologist for MG, you would still be seeing them as part of your routine MG follow-up. So this is sort of an extra that you'll be taking on.
Just one thing to add is, though, definitely if you are seeing, like, for example, Dr. Malik for the research study, but you have a different neurologist, they would definitely be talking to each other so that they know what's going on.
And my next question, I think you answered earlier, Angela. Does anyone who's getting a placebo get no treatment at all?
Sure. So it varies across the different studies. So in our trial, if you are randomized to the placebo arm, because of the way we designed the trial, we allow patients to stay on some of their standard of care treatment. But it's not necessarily that way in all studies. But it really depends on how the company has designed the studies.
So this is when no one, your regular physician, a pharma company, is allowed to put you at risk without a potential benefit. So it is not, for example, if there is an active treatment for a disease like there is for MG, it's not possible for a drug company to ask you to stop all treatment and be put on a placebo. That would never be allowed by the FDA, which reviews all the clinical trial protocol. So, in the RA study, like in our study, if you are on a treatment, you will be able to continue this treatment even if you are randomized to the placebo, because it would not be what we call ethical to deprive patients of the benefit of therapies that are working. Yeah. So it's really big role.
And then the other thing to add is many companies, I would believe almost all of them, have like an extension period where all patients who, even if they receive placebo or active drug during that double-blinded portion where no one knows who's getting which arm, after the end of that, everyone will have the option of enrolling into either a separate study or into another phase of the study where they receive the active study drug.
If a patient has to travel or chooses to or is able to travel, does that get reimbursed? How does that work?
Sure. So I would say in general in clinical trials, again, we hope to select sites that are within distance to many patients, but obviously there are going to be, since we can't have one site per every city or every major city in the country, there is some travel involved. And for example, for our study, we do provide travel assistance and reimbursement for that. For all clinical trials, I would say that, there's reimbursement for out-of-pocket costs, so things like parking or mileage, there's definitely coverage for that. All of that information would be in your consent form. For our study, for example, if, because you have to receive the Neisseria meningitis vaccination, that wouldn't be out of pocket. Anything that's study related, we would pay for.
Yeah, and that, I agree with that now this is really common practice among all drug companies, and it can go very far. For example, we are running another study in pregnant women. We have some, because it's a very rare disease and there are very, very few physicians who know how to treat it. We have patients crossing borders in Europe to participate in a trial, and even because it's pregnancy, and so it is so, everyone is really following the patient and the baby very closely. At the end of the study, the patient is hospitalized or is located where the clinical trial is. This is also covered. So this is really becoming now common practice, and we won't, house patients in a luxury accommodation, but we will cover a reasonable cost, no matter what they are, if they are necessary for you to participate in a clinical trial.
Okay. Thank you. Angela, if a patient gets very sick, if say someone's in a trial and they get sick, what happens? Like sick to the point where,
Sure. So there's a few different things. One is if they're very sick and it's due to the study drug, then based on the discussions with the study doctor, we would take the patient off the study drug if that's what's causing them to be sick. If they, for example, in our study, we do have that placebo arm, and if patients deteriorate or get weaker, we have the option of rescue treatment with IVIG or plasmapheresis, and those items are covered by the sponsor. So those are a few things that happen. I don't know if Dr. Malik, you have anything to add to that.
Right. In my experience with working on the raw pharma, our patient did require rescue treatment, so he was admitted for IVIG, and our patient was still able to continue the study drug because we didn't feel like the study drug caused the MG exacerbation. So definitely there are safety nets in place. There may be a situation where you would be taken off the study drug, but it's possible that you may still be continued on in this research study, and there may be escalation of care in your MG with regards to a hospital admission with IVIG or plasmapheresis.
why do some people choose to participate, Angela? Or, sorry, Dr. Malik, why? You addressed this a little bit, but keep going.
I think the patients that participate in drug trials and clinical trials are really just frustrated by the disease, and they feel like they've tried all the options, the first line treatment, the second line treatment, and they're still quite symptomatic from their disease. So they're really at their they're desperate for treatment options, and they are hopeful that this new drug that's still not available but may be effective in their case. So for clinical trials or drug trials, I feel like it's the patients who are just not doing well with the treatment regimens that are available. For patients who participate in other types of studies like observational studies and data registry, they are just looking to help other people, and they feel like since they struggle so much with their own disease, they want to give back and hopefully increase the understanding and knowledge around the disease.
Angela, pros and cons of participating, and what are the you went over some of the most important considerations, but could you recap that?
Sure. So let's start with the positive stuff. So some pros are, you could potentially receive a drug that, so for example, like Dr. Malik said, if you are frustrated with your current options or nothing's working, then you could potentially receive a drug that would work for you. Then the con side of that is maybe it won't work for you, or maybe you'll be put on the placebo arm or randomized to the placebo arm, so that could be frustrating. Some other things that should be taken into consideration is time. It takes time to go to these visits. A lot of times companies will try to provide ways so that you could come in less frequently as the study goes on. Like for example, in a long-term extension, there may be less frequent visits and less frequent assessments, but maybe you'll have to just come in to pick up your study drug. Or some companies even use different companies to ship the drug from the hospital to you. Those are some options. Other things to think about are, let's see, the one other thing I think is you have the kind of a huge team of doctors if you're on a research trial that you may not be able to access normally. So those are other things to think about. And I think that's it, other than the additional things that Dr. Malik covered in her presentation.
Any misconceptions that you'd love to clear up today?
I think one is that I think sometimes people don't understand that there is a very rigorous process in order to get a clinical trial approved. So one, we have to go through the design and all the, like our Momenta colleagues mentioned, there's like all this risk and benefit ratio that the FDA looks at. So sometimes you can go through multiple rounds with the FDA to come up with the design that they agree with, that they think is worth the risk, that there is enough benefit to for the risks. And then after that, you actually have to get the study approved at the Institutional Review Board, so the IRB, which consists of scientists, doctors, people who are just like in the lay community, so just someone from the community to sit on that board to agree that after looking at this study that it would be acceptable to do the research study at the site. So I think there are multiple steps that we have to go through to ensure that this is approved and considered not safe enough, but basically that it can be, the risk to benefit ratio is sufficient for someone to participate. And then I think the other one, I think Dr. Malik already mentioned, is that you're not stuck in a clinical trial. If you consent and you agree to participate, at any point you can withdraw from the study. Obviously, from our perspective, if you have agreed to join the study, it would be great if you could comply with your visits and come to every visit on time. But you are, as the study participant, you have every right to say, you know what, I don't want to do this, I don't want to continue. And so it is not a contract. And in terms of the consent process, it doesn't just stop at the beginning where you sign that form. Throughout the entire study, you can ask as many questions as you want. I'm sure Dr. Malik would love to hear them.
Dr. Malik, any misconceptions that you've had with your patients even?
Right, just as Angela described, so a lot of people fear research studies, right, because they feel like I'm a guinea pig in this. But as Angela mentioned, there's a rigorous process that happens before any type of a research study. So, these hypotheses and theories and, things have been tested in a laboratory for years, and then perhaps in a phase 1 trial. So there's a lot of information and brain power that goes behind design of a lot of these clinical trials. So it's important to recognize that and understand that.
This is one of my favorite questions because I think there's some misconception about this one. What does it mean to have a successful trial?
That's also a loaded question. We've got some good questions. So actually, it's a misconception that all clinical trials will make it through every phase. The majority of drug development stops at the phase 2 level because at that point you find out that maybe the drug is not working well enough, so you don't proceed into the next steps. And I think even if a trial is not successful or does not meet its goals or the endpoints, like I mentioned for our studies, you still learn a lot from those research studies. There's a lot of information collected and things that other studies or pharma companies can learn from that failed study. However, obviously the most successful study would be one that meets the goals that you predefined, that you came to an agreement with the FDA, that these are the goals and things that we want to see at the end of the study, and to meet those, and that's successful.
I feel like one of the things that researchers learns a lot of times is about the design of the study, right? That we didn't reach the endpoints. Oh, partly it's because we didn't set it up right, or with the right time frame, or things like that.
Exactly, and when you're developing the trial, you work very closely with like a statistician to make sure that you kind of, even in the early stages, you think of what do you want to see at the end, how do you make sure that you develop a robust and good clinical trial to get those answers, because you want to make sure it's successful and it moves on so that we can provide drugs to patients.
Dr. Malik, anything you'd add about what success means for you?
No, I agree with Angela. Even a failed treatment is a successful treatment, just because you learn why it failed, and you learn a little bit more about the disease. So I think it's still a success.
So this probably just underscores that if a trial fails, does it mean the therapy is no good? It's like, no, right? You already answered that. Okay, good. Okay. Why now? After 30 years with no new MG treatments, why are we seeing so much activity now? Angela?
I think there's just been a lot of research and science that's been done, I think it was in the 1970s, where there was that understanding that complement plays a role in MG, so there's been a lot of research being done there. And it just takes time. Even, when someone comes up with the idea or understanding of how something works, it just takes a lot of steps to get to even clinical trials, and that's why it takes a while.
Dr. Malik?
Yes, I think it's just because we understand the disease a little bit differently now than we did before. We are recognizing that there are a number of other players, not just acetylcholine receptor antibodies. We kind of talked about that a little bit. So I think that's really kind of spearheaded and really been the reason why there's been such an explosion for research and now clinical drugs that are available.
Is the research with MG helping to understand other diseases as well?
Absolutely. So Myasthenia gravis is a type of an autoimmune disease, right? So just as MG has benefited from other drugs and research in other in other diseases like SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, we've used the same medications to treat Myasthenia gravis. So similarly, drugs that are successful for MG, we can extrapolate and think that other autoimmune diseases may actually respond to these same treatments also.
I've got three kind of broad questions, but I know we should get time to get everybody else's questions. So I'll skip to drugs are slow to develop in the rare diseases. Angela, I think, are you doing is Pharma doing anything to try and change this?
I think just specifically, we work as fast as possible, to be honest with you. We're designing our studies so that they're shorter than the longer. Some studies used to be like a year or 2 years of the treatment period. I mean, our study is a 12-week treatment period with the switch over to an open label extension, so we're doing that. Also, I think just in general, we work as fast as we can to clean, like when we have all the patients enrolled and all the data collected, we are doing our best to work as quickly as possible to shorten that time where we review the data and analyze the data to move forward to the next steps.
Any last statements you'd like to make before we head over to individual questions?
Right. I hope you learned from this seminar here today that clinical trials are important, right? It helps us understand the disease a little bit better, and hopefully it helps us in designing new treatment options that may be a little bit more effective, that may be helpful in improving your quality of life, and may allow you more days where you feel like you don't have MG and you don't feel like an MG patient.
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity. I know clinical trials can kind of sound like a scary thing, and hopefully we've helped take that stigma away, that we really are working towards providing new treatments and therapies for patients.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm going to